All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 11, Section 3, Independence for Texas. So in some of the last sections, we talked about how American expansion westward heightened tensions between the United States and Spain, which had a presence in the Southwest that resulted in the acquisition of Florida and a border that was set up between Spain and the U.S. But that changed beginning in 1821, only in the sense that Spain was replaced by Mexico. So Mexican independence from Spain in 1821. In fact, for much of South America, independence came from the Spanish crown anywhere between, around 1800 through 1825 in those years. Mexico gained their independence in 1821. So it's no longer really an issue between the US and Spain, but rather an issue between the United States and now the Mexican government. So in Texas, you can't really see it from the map that is provided in the text, but this is a map that is, for whatever reason, a bird here, showing the border that was established. Maybe a different color here. So this was initially the border that was established between the Spain and the United States. Everything on the right side was U.S. territory. Everything on the left side was Mexican territory. And this is essentially where Texas kind of falls in this particular region. Now, both Spain and Mexico encouraged Anglo settlement into Texas. By Anglo, we mean English speaking. So in terms of language, people who speak English, and in general are Protestants. So it's much more of an ethnic category. That's opposed to the majority of people in the Spanish Empire, now Mexico, who are Spanish speakers and tend to be Roman Catholics. The reason why settlement was encouraged into this part of Texas was that it was an area that was very sparsely populated. Both the Spanish and the Mexican government hoped that by bringing people there, that it would help, make that land more productive. They could essentially turn that land into farming or whatever it was, irrigation. They could invest in the land, they could improve the land, and they could be taxpayers for the Mexican government. And so the Mexican and the Spanish government worked with people called empresarios. An empresario was a person who agreed to resettle people in Texas. Resettle people in Texas. At the time, this was Moses and Stephen Austin, father and son, made an agreement with the Mexican government to bring over 300 Anglo families to resettle in Texas. There were some strings attached. So, for example, these Anglo families had to become Catholics. There was a concern by the Mexican government that, if these people don't assimilate into Mexican society, become Mexican citizens, adopt Catholicism, that perhaps their loyalty might stay with the United States. In the end, that is what happened, but there were some conditions to this agreement that those settlers must assimilate. This was the people that were being brought in addition to the Spanish-speaking population of Texas called Tejanos. So we might call these the Spanish/Catholic population of Texas. Really made up kind of the two major demographic groups there. There were also a large number of Native Americans. Texas at this particular time was very, very, very sparsely populated, not a lot of people there, and very far away from the center of the Mexican government at Mexico City. So it was a territory from the perspective of Mexico that was very, very far away, very hard to administer, not a lot of people, and pretty underdeveloped in terms of making it profitable or something like that. And increasingly, it was these Anglo families that continued to move to Texas at a very, very rapid rate, a very rapid number, ultimately outnumbering the Tejano population. So by 1835 or so, there were more English-speaking Protestants in Texas than really any other demographic group. And this ended up creating some tensions between the two sides, right? Tensions between the Anglo population and the Mexican government. First and foremost, there was the fact that most Anglos were still loyal to the US government rather than the Mexican government. There was also the problem of the legal system for many Anglo settlers. In terms of local legal disputes, it was typically resolved by an alcalde. An alcalde is just, we'll say, a Mexican administrator. Oops. And any sort of local legal matter would get sent to a different part of the territory or of the country. In other words, many of the disputes, we might say disputes, we'll say legal disputes, were not settled locally, right? Certainly not in the way that they were in the United States. But perhaps the one tension that, at least for us anyways, is the most important one was the fact that in 1829, 1829, the Mexican government abolished slavery, and this was especially a contentious point with those slaveholders who lived in Texas. And so all of these things together, the abolition of slavery, the Mexican legal system, the fact that the fact that many of these Anglo settlers remained loyal to the US rather than the Mexican government, this was creating a recipe for conflict. Some of it began to bubble up when Hayden Edwards, he was an Anglo living in Texas, he essentially captured the local alcalde there. Probably pronouncing that right, alcalde. Captured the local alcalde there, which caused the Mexican government to send troops up there. The problem of Anglo migration was so bad that in 1830, the Mexican government banned Anglo migration to Texas. This sort of brief revolt led by Hayden Edwards was put down, but it was kind of evidence that there were more problems on the horizon. Now, in the midst of all this tension, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna became the president of Mexico. And in doing so, initially anyways, appeased many of the demands that the Anglos had in Texas. However, not shortly afterwards, he ended up abolishing all state governments, including the state government there in Texas, where many Anglos lived. We can call him essentially the president of Mexico, president/military dictator, because that's essentially what he became. He just abolished pretty much all of the representative governments. Now, the people in Texas, especially the Anglo population, took this as an opportunity to declare themselves independent. They captured the city of San Antonio from the Mexican government, and in 1836 had a declaration to separate from Mexico. And essentially, it was this declaration that ultimately led to what we might call the Texas Revolution, the conflict between the people living in Texas and the Mexican government. Santa Anna and others sent troops up to, crush this rebellion. This ultimately led to the Battle of the Alamo, in which those fighting for the Texan side were killed. Amongst them was Davy Crockett. We'll just say killed. He was a famous frontiersman at the time, killed at Battle of Alamo. Right, this was a local mission in San Antonio, Battle of the Alamo. We'll just call this clash between Mexico and Texas. This was, in this case, a Mexican victory. Pretty much all of the people, all the Texans fighting at the Alamo were killed. As revenge, Sam Houston was put in charge of Texan forces. We might just say general. I don't know what his actual title was, but general of Texan forces. Led an attack against Mexican forces at the Battle of San Jacinto, which in a lot of ways was a victory for the Texans, even leading to the capture of Santa Ana. And that led to, when Santa Ana was captured, a treaty to, and I'll just scroll down here a little bit, recognize an independent Texas. Right, so just so they've got kind of everything in line here. Sam Houston was general of Texan forces in this revolution. The Battle of San Jacinto was a victory for the Texans, led to the capture of Santa Ana, which led to a treaty that recognized an independent Texas. The slogan at the Battle of San Jacinto, and really in a lot of ways the slogan of just Texas in general, is to remember the Alamo, remember the Alamo, in which pretty much all Texan forces were killed at that. And so this led to Texan independence. Like I had mentioned before, this is 1836. Texas breaks away officially from Mexico, but there's a problem. And that is, on the one hand, it's Santa Ana who signed the treaty saying that Texas would be independent. On the other hand, it's the Mexican Congress who says Santa Ana is not in power anymore and therefore has no right or really legal power to recognize the independence of Texas. And so this becomes a much disputed claim, Texas does, between both the United States and Mexico. So we'll just say no. So Texas becomes a Lone Star Republic. It's very interesting to note that Texas, sort of just a fun fact, is the only U.S. state to become only U.S. state to, actually, I don't want to say become, just to be an independent nation. To be an independent nation from 1836 to about 1845. Texas is its own country, hence the nickname Lone Star, right? Because Texas was all by itself, essentially. Now, the idea right from the get-go was not just to break away from Mexico and create an independent nation. The plan from the get-go was always to become part of the U.S., right? Be part of the U.S. But there are some problems here. One problem is, what will it do to U.S./Mexico relations? Right? That is to say, it's not really unanimously agreed upon in Mexico anyways, that Texas is truly independent. Did Santa Ana have the authority to sign that treaty granting independence? Well, the Mexican Congress says no. This is also the case in terms of not just whether Texas is independent, but where exactly does the border lie? That is the ultimate concern that actually is between the United States and Mexico, is where does that border lie? But maybe even more important, and this, of course, plays into our, the larger theme of our class here, is the status of slavery in Texas. That is to say that Texas, at the time of applying for annexation, has, I think, approximately 15,000 slaves living in Texas. And so much like the case of Missouri, there are many Northerners who oppose Texas, because if Texas is added to the Union, Texas becomes the largest slave state in the Union. So it has this sort of divisive effect. And it's very interesting to note that for as strong as Manifest Destiny and Westward Expansion was, for as aggressive as the United States was in acquiring territory, you're really hard pressed to find instances where the US does not look to add more land. And in this case, there seems to be one issue that supersedes westward expansion, and that is the issue of slavery. And again, this is kind of getting down to the root problem that eventually leads to the breakup of the United States. Texas was populated very, very quickly after it became independent. People would say GTT, or gone to Texas. This was especially a result of the Panic of 1837, where people lost their businesses, lost their jobs, and just went to Texas in order to start a new life. After becoming independent, the state of Texas, or the Lone Star Republic, carried out a pretty aggressive policy of removing and waging war against the Native American populations within their borders. Both the Cherokee and the Comanche were tribes Texas sought to push out, very much in the same spirit as Indian removal and the Trail of Tears, which is occurring right at the same time here, 1836, 1837.